His wife, the woman he promised to love for eternity, was dying on an operating table just 20 feet away. Her screams had just faded into a terrifying silence. But David Harris wasn't alone in the hallway. His mistress Chloe stood beside him, and as the doctor approached with a face like stone, Chloe let out a quiet, sharp laugh. She had won. The obstacle was gone. David was hers. The doctor looked past David, her eyes boring into the mistress, and whispered the 4 words that would turn Chloe's victory into her own personal hell. We saved the babies. It's twins. The house in Tarrytown, Austin, was a monument to good taste. David Harris, a man whose architectural firm was redefining the city skyline, had designed it himself. It was all glass-warm limestone and clean lines overlooking a verdant swell of the Colorado River. His wife, Sarah Jenkins Harris, had filled it with life. Sarah, a respected art curator, had a warmth that softened David's sharp edges. Their life was by all accounts perfect. Except for the silence. For 7 years the house had been quiet. It was a silence punctuated by timed injections, devastating negative pregnancy tests, and the quiet, sterile grief of infertility. They had poured a small fortune into Austin IVF, and their marriage, once a passionate partnership, had become a shared, grueling project. Then, on their 8th try, it worked. Sarah was now 38 weeks pregnant, radiant and heavy with their miracle. The silence was finally gone, replaced by the assembly of a crib, the painting of a nursery, a soft, hopeful sage green, and endless, joyful debates over a single name, Oliver. On this last, perfect Sunday, Sarah was arranging tiny, hand-knitted booties on a shelf. David watched her from the doorway, a knot of something dark and heavy in his stomach. He loved her. God, he loved her. He loved the way she hummed when she was happy, the gentle curve of her spine as she bent over her work. He loved this baby, their baby, with a fierce protective instinct. But he was also a coward. The new schematic for the 6th Street Tower is a nightmare, he said, loosening his collar. I'm going to have to pull an all-nighter at the office. Sarah turned, her smile only slightly dimmed. Oh, David again, that's the 3rd time this week. I know. It's just this project. It's make or break. Once this is done, I'm all yours. I promise. He crossed the room, kissed her forehead, and placed a hand on the taut drum of her belly. And yours, Oliver. The baby kicked as if in protest. Sarah covered his hand with hers. Okay, just be careful. I love you. I love you too, David whispered. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. He didn't drive to the downtown office. He drove to a sleek, impersonal condo building on South Congress. He took the elevator to the 14th floor. The door opened before he could knock. Chloe Sanders didn't wait for him to step inside. She pulled him in by his tie, her mouth finding his. She was all sharp angles, expensive perfume, and thrilling, dangerous ambition. Chloe was a new associate at his firm, 28 years old, and saw David not as a man, but as a prize. You're late, she murmured against his lips. Sarah was... She was organizing the nursery, he said, his guilt returning. Chloe rolled her eyes, pulling away to pour 2 glasses of wine. The nursery? How sweet! Did you tell her you're not going to be there to see it, that you're going to be with me? Chloe, we talked about this. It's complicated. The baby is coming. The baby, she scoffed, handing him the glass. That's all she has, I have you, your mind, your ambition, your future. She's your past, David. A bloated, sentimental past. You know you can't stay. Once the kid is born, you have to choose. He knew she was right. He had to choose. But as he looked at Chloe, so fierce and uncompromising, he felt a different kind of trap closing in. The affair, which had started as a reckless escape from the sterile, scheduled world of IVF, had become a second parallel life. And it was a life that was demanding he burn the first one to the ground. Just not tonight, Chloe. Let's not talk about her tonight, he said, setting the wine down. She smiled, a slow, predatory curving of her lips. Fine. Let's not talk at all. As he fell into her, he forced the image of the sage-green nursery and the tiny, hand-knitted booties from his mind. He was a man living two lives, and he was about to find out in the most brutal way possible that you can't build a new life on a foundation of lies. The entire structure was about to come crashing down. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in deception. David Harris moved through his perfect home like a ghost, his body present, his mind 1,000 miles away at a condo on South Congress. He was attentive to Sarah, rubbing her swollen feet, fetching her ice chips, telling her how beautiful she was. And every word of it was true, which only made the lies he told Chloe feel more poisonous. To Chloe, he was the trapped husband, counting the seconds until he could be free. He was building a fantasy with her, a future in a penthouse, trips to Milan, a life unburdened by the domesticity that he claimed was suffocating him. He was two different men, and the strain was making him crack. Sarah, for all her focus on the baby, was not a fool. She had built a career on noticing the details others missed, the subtle shift in a painter's brushstroke, the hidden meaning in a line. And she saw the changes in David. It wasn't one big thing. It was 1,000 tiny, unraveling threads. It was the way he now showered the moment he came home from working late, when he used to just collapse on the sofa with her. It was the scent of a perfume on his suit jacket. Not hers. Something sharper, musky. Santal 33. It was the ping of his phone, which he now kept face down on the nightstand at 2 in the morning. The final thread was an American Express bill. He'd left it on his desk, an oversight born of arrogance. Sarah was looking for a stamp. She saw the charge. Uchi. $480. On a Tuesday night, he had supposedly been eating stale pizza with his draft team. She didn't cry. The shock was too cold for that. She simply sat in his leather office chair, the white rectangle of paper trembling in her hand, and waited for him to come home. He walked in at 7 p.m., all smiles, holding a bouquet of Sarah's favorite white peonies. "For my two favorite people," he said, leaning in to kiss her. Sarah turned her head. He kissed the air. "What's wrong?" he asked, his smile faltering. She held up the receipt. "How was the spicy tuna?" David's blood ran cold. The color drained from his face. There was no lie big enough to cover this. "Sarah, I can explain." "Can you?" Her voice was quiet, but it was the most dangerous sound he had ever heard. "Can you explain the perfume? Can you explain the 2 a.m. text messages? Can you explain, David, how you could do this to me, to us, now?" She gestured to her stomach, her hand shaking. It just happened," he stammered, the peonies hanging limply from his hand. "It's this woman at work, Chloe Sanders. It doesn't mean anything, Sarah. I swear. It's been so hard, the IVF, everything." "Don't," she hissed, and now the tears came hot and angry. "Don't you dare use our son as an excuse for this. You think it's been hard for you? I'm the one who's been pumped full of hormones, who's had my body poked and prodded for 7 years. I'm the one carrying this child, and you go find someone. New. He had no defense. He just stood there as her grief and rage washed over him. Who is she? Sarah finally whispered, wiping her face. It doesn't matter. It's over. I'll end it tonight. I'll fire her. Sarah, please. Look at me. I love you. This baby is my world. Sarah stared at him for a long, agonizing minute. He saw the calculation in her eyes. She was weighing 7 years of love against 1 night of definitive proof. I don't believe you, she said finally, her voice flat. I don't believe it's over, but here is what's going to happen. You are going to stop. You are going to delete her number. You are going to end this, and you are going to be here for the birth of your son. We are not going to talk about this again until Oliver is home and safe. I will not bring this child into a broken home. Do you understand me, David? It was more than he deserved. It was a lifeline. He grabbed it. Yes, he said, sinking to his knees, pressing his face to her stomach. Yes, Sarah. Anything. It's over. I promise. It's over. But as he held his weeping wife, his phone vibrated in his pocket. A text from Chloe. Thinking of you. Can't wait for tonight. David Harris, the brilliant architect, the coward, the liar, did the one thing he knew how to do. He silenced his phone and held his wife tighter, trapping the lie between them. He didn't end it. He just got better at hiding it. He told Chloe that Sarah was suspicious and that he had to be careful for a few weeks, which only made their stolen moments more illicit, more thrilling for her. Chloe, in her predatory confidence, was fine with this. She knew she had him. It was just a matter of time. Sarah, meanwhile, retreated. She focused on the baby. She stopped asking David where he was. She simply watched the clock, her eyes hollow, and prayed that her family, which hadn't even officially begun, could survive its first mortal wound. The week of Sarah's due date, a heavy, humid stillness settled over Austin. The air was thick, charged with the promise of a storm. It was a perfect mirror for the atmosphere inside the glass house in Tarrytown. Sarah was on edge, not just from the pregnancy, but from the palpable tension. David was a caricature of a devoted husband, a man playing a role so hard it was painful to watch. He was home every night by 6 phone placed screen up on the counter. But his eyes were distant, and he jumped every time the doorbell rang. The confrontation had changed nothing except to make the silence between them heavier. On Tuesday, Sarah had her 39-week checkup. David had a critical meeting he couldn't miss. It's with the city council, babe. I have to be there. I'll be there for the main event, I promise. It's fine, David, Sarah said, tying her sneakers, her feet so swollen she could barely see them. My mother is taking me. Her mother, Margaret Jenkins, was a woman cut from stern Texas granite. She had never fully trusted David, finding his charm too polished, his ambition too sharp. She arrived in her practical Volvo, took one look at her daughter, and her lips thinned. You look exhausted, Sarah. He's not helping, is he? He's busy, Mom. The 6th Street Tower. Right. The tower. Margaret said the word dripping with disbelief. At the clinic, Dr. Evelyn Miller, a brisk, brilliant OB-GYN who had guided them through the entire IVF journey, entered the exam room. Her normal, cheerful demeanor was gone. Sarah Margaret, let's get your blood pressure. The cuff hissed. Dr. Miller looked at the reading. She took it again. Sarah, she said, her voice calm but firm. Your pressure is 180/110. That's dangerously high. What? But I feel... Okay. Just tired. That's the scary thing about preeclampsia. I'm also seeing protein in your urine sample. We need to get you to the hospital. Now. We're not waiting for labor. We're inducing you today." A jolt of panic, cold and electric, shot through Sarah. "Today? But David. He's in a meeting." "Call him," Dr. Miller said, already pulling off her gloves and typing into her tablet. "I'm admitting you to St. David's Medical Center. I'll meet you there in 20 minutes. Margaret was already on the phone, her face grim. "David, it's Margaret. Sarah's in trouble. Preeclampsia. They're inducing her now at St. David's." David was, in fact, in a meeting, but it wasn't with the city council. It was in a dark, plush booth at the W Hotel bar, his leg pressed against Chloe's. They were drinking champagne, celebrating the hypothetical future where he was free. His phone buzzed. Margaret Jenkins. He winced and silenced it. "Who's that?" Chloe asked, tracing the rim of her glass. "No one. Just work." The phone buzzed again. "Margaret Jenkins." He silenced it again. "You're a terrible liar, David," Chloe purred. "It's her, isn't it?" Before he could answer, the phone buzzed a third time. Sarah. His heart hammered. Sarah never called him when she was with her mother. He picked it up. "Sarah, is everything okay? David." It was Margaret's voice, sharp with terror. "I'm driving her. She's... God, David, she says she can't see properly. Her vision is blurred. Get to the hospital." "St. David's, now." The line went dead. The blood drained from David's face. Blurred vision. High blood pressure. He'd read the pamphlets. This was bad. This was red alert bad. "I have to go," he said, throwing cash on the table. "What?" Chloe's face twisted in rage. "You're kidding me. She's faking it, David. It's a ploy to get you back." "She's not faking." He snapped, his voice raw with a sudden real fear. "She's at the hospital. It's the baby. It's happening." He ran from the bar, leaving Chloe sitting alone in the booth. She sat there for a full minute, the champagne tasting sour. He had left her. When it came down to it, when the real thing happened, he ran back to his wife. He chose her. A cold, narcissistic fury, deeper and more potent than any she had ever felt, settled over her. She was not a woman to be discarded. She was not the other woman. She was the main woman. And she was going to prove it. She pulled out her phone and called an Uber. "St. David's Medical Center," she told the driver, her voice perfectly calm. "And please drive quickly. It's an emergency." She was going to the hospital. She was going to find David. She was going to force the choice right then and there. She would not be hidden. She would not be ignored. The storm had finally broken, and Chloe Sanders intended to be the one left standing when the floodwaters receded. The maternity ward at St. David's was a place of frantic, controlled chaos. When Margaret's Volvo screeched to a halt at the emergency entrance, Sarah was barely conscious. A team was waiting. They rushed her to a labor and delivery room, alarms already beeping. Dr. Evelyn Miller was there, scrubbed and focused. "She's in severe preeclampsia, bordering on eclampsia," she snapped to the nurses. "Get me a magnesium sulfate drip now and prep for an emergency C-section. She's crashing. This isn't just preeclampsia. I think it's HELP syndrome." HELP syndrome. The acronym was a death sentence: hemolysis, elevated liver enzymes, low platelet count. It was the body's ultimate betrayal, a catastrophic failure of its systems in response to pregnancy. David sprinted through the automatic doors, his heart threatening to burst from his chest. He found the maternity floor and saw Margaret, pale and trembling, outside L&D room 3. "Where is she? Is she okay?" "They took her," Margaret whispered, her eyes burning with hatred. "They're trying to stabilize her, her liver, her platelets. Oh God, David." She dissolved into sobs. A nurse, Brenda, a kind woman with weary eyes, stepped out. Mr. Harris? Your wife is asking for you. David pushed past Margaret and into the room. It was like a war zone. Machines shrieked, and Sarah, his beautiful, warm Sarah, was unrecognizable. She was swollen, her skin a sickly pale, and her eyes were wild with terror. "David," she cried, grabbing his hand with a strength he didn't know she possessed. I can't feel my hands. I'm so scared. David, the baby. Just save our baby. Promise me, save Oliver. I promise, he sobbed, kissing her clammy forehead. We're both right here. We love you. Mr. Harris, you need to step out. We're taking her to the OR. Now. Dr. Miller commanded her voice, leaving no room for argument. They wheeled Sarah out. David stumbled back into the hallway, his legs giving out. He collapsed onto a cold plastic waiting room chair, his head in his hands. He was a fraud. His wife was dying, and the last coherent thing he had done was lie to her. Mr. Harris. He looked up. His blood turned to ice. Chloe Sanders was standing in front of him. She was wearing a black silk blouse and leather pants, looking utterly out of place like a vulture in a dove's nest. Chloe, he whispered, horrified. What are you doing here? You can't be here. I can't, she said, her voice dangerously low. You ran out on me, David. You left me in that bar like I was nothing. I'm not nothing, David. I'm your future. Chloe gestured contemptuously toward the OR doors. Is your past. I'm here to make sure you remember that. Get out, David hissed, jumping to his feet. He grabbed her arm, trying to pull her toward the elevators. This is a hospital. Your wife is dying. Chloe's voice rose, turning heads at the nurse's station. Nurse Brenda's eyes widened. And you know what, it's for the best. She's weak. She was holding you back. Now you and I can finally be together. You and me and... She paused, a strange, triumphant smile playing on her lips. She had been saving this. This was her ace. And our baby, Chloe said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. David froze. What? I'm pregnant, David. 10 weeks. I was going to tell you tonight over champagne. Congratulations, Daddy. It looks like you're going to be a father after all. The world tilted. Pregnant. Chloe was pregnant. His wife was on an operating table fighting for her life, and the life of their son, and his mistress was here telling him she was also pregnant. It was a nightmare. It was a hell of his own making. Chloe, you don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly. You're mine. That thing in there is just a complication. And complications, she said, her eyes glinting, can be removed. You're a monster, David breathed, recoiling from her. I'm a survivor, she corrected. And I'm not leaving. I'm going to wait right here for the good news. Before David could respond, before he could physically throw her out of the hospital, the doors to the operating hallway swung open. Nurse Brenda was walking quickly toward Dr. Miller, who was at the scrub sink. Doctor, Brenda said, her voice low but urgent. That woman in the hall, the one in the black blouse, she was just screaming at Mr. Harris. She said, that thing in there is just a complication, and that she's pregnant with his baby. Dr. Miller stopped scrubbing. She slowly turned her eyes over the top of her surgical mask, hardening into chips of ice. She had just seen Sarah Harris's platelet count. She knew what was happening. She had seen this kind of tragedy before, but the cruelty in the waiting room was a new, horrifying variable. Keep her away from L&D, Dr. Miller ordered. Call security if you have to, and get Mr. Harris back in here. He needs to prepare himself. The battle in the OR was failing. The war in the waiting room was just beginning. Time dissolved into a thick, syrupy dread. David sat on one side of the waiting room near the OR doors, his body vibrating with guilt and fear. Chloe, defiant, had taken a seat on the far side by the elevators, casually scrolling through her phone, as if she were waiting for a table at a restaurant. Margaret had gone to the chapel, unable to bear the sterile, terrifying proximity to the operating room. David prayed. He prayed to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. He prayed for Sarah. He prayed for Oliver. He prayed for this nightmare to end, for the clock to rewind, for a chance to undo the last 6 months of his life. An hour passed, then 2. The atmosphere on the floor shifted. Nurses moved with a new grim urgency. David heard a code blue paged over the intercom, followed by L&D Operating Room 2. Sarah's room. He shot to his feet. A nurse gently pushed him back. "Sir, please wait." He watched helpless as the crash cart was slammed through the doors. He heard a new level of frantic shouted commands from inside, and then a sound that would haunt him forever, a long, single, continuous beep. The sound of a flat line. Chloe looked up from her phone, a flicker of interest in her eyes. She saw David's white-knuckled grip on the chair. She saw the panic. She saw the tears streaming down his face. And then the OR doors opened. Dr. Evelyn Miller walked out. She was no longer a surgeon. She was an executioner. She had stripped off her bloody gloves and her scrub cap. Her short gray hair was matted with sweat. Her face was a mask of profound professional grief. She walked directly to David. He already knew. He was already shaking his head. "No. No. No. Mr. Harris. David." Dr. Miller's voice was low, tired. "We did everything we could. Sarah's HELP syndrome was catastrophic. Her liver failed. She developed DIC. She was bleeding from everywhere. We couldn't stop it. We gave her 30 units of blood, but she threw a massive embolism." The doctor took a deep breath. "I'm so sorry. We lost her. Sarah, she's gone." David Harris shattered. A sound left his body that wasn't human. It was a raw animal wail of pure agony. He collapsed, his body folding in on itself, his hands clawing at his face. He had killed her. His lies, his stress, his betrayal, he had killed her. And from across the waiting room came another sound. A laugh. It was quiet, sharp, and utterly unmistakable. A single, triumphant bark. David's head snapped up. Chloe was standing now, a hand partially covering her mouth, but her eyes were dancing with victory. She had won. The wife was dead. The obstacle was gone. David was grieving, yes, but he would get over it. He was hers. All of him. And his fortune. She walked over her heels, clicking on the linoleum, her face a perfect, false mask of sympathy. "Oh, David, darling, I'm so terribly sorry for your loss. What a tragedy." David, in his shock and grief, could only stare at her. Dr. Miller's eyes, which had been fixed on David, slowly swiveled to Chloe. She recognized her instantly. The woman from the hallway. The complication. Her gaze was so cold, so filled with contempt it could have frozen fire. Chloe's smirk faltered under the weight of it. "Mr. Harris," Dr. Miller said, her voice suddenly sharp, deliberately cutting through Chloe's performance. She did not take her eyes off the mistress. "Mr. Harris, we couldn't save Sarah." She paused. "But we saved the babies." David's head, buried in his hands, came up slowly. "What babies? No, it's a boy. Oliver." Dr. Miller finally turned her gaze back to David, and for the first time a flicker of softness entered her eyes. "It was a surprise," she said, her voice gentle, but loud enough for Chloe to hear every word. One baby was positioned directly behind the other on every ultrasound. It's rare, but it happens. We didn't know until we got in. She knelt, putting a hand on David's shoulder. "You have a son, David. He's tiny, but he's a fighter. And you have a daughter. It's twins." The 4 words hit the air. It's twins. Chloe's face, which had been alight with triumph, went utterly dreadfully pale. The smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of chalk-white horror. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Twins. Not one inconvenient, grieving child. 2. 2 babies. 2 permanent, unbreakable living links to the sainted dead wife. 2 heirs to the Harris legacy. 2 tiny, screaming, expensive reminders of Sarah forever. Her own pregnancy, which she had seen as her trump card, her checkmate, was suddenly a liability. She wasn't an exciting new life. She was just the other one. The one with the 3rd baby. David was no longer a grieving widower she could comfort and claim. He was a single father of newborn twins. Her victory, so sweet just seconds before, had turned to ash in her mouth. She backed away, stumbling, her eyes wide with panic. She had laughed, and now the universe was laughing back. The days that followed were a blur of antiseptic smells, the rhythmic beeping of NICU machinery, and a crushing, suffocating guilt. The twins, Oliver and Olivia, were impossibly small, their bodies lost in a tangle of wires and tubes inside their separate incubators. They were Sarah's. They had her delicate eyelids, her fine hair, and David, looking at them through the clear plastic, felt nothing but a profound, hollow sense of being an imposter. Sarah's funeral was a quiet, agonizing affair. Margaret Jenkins stood at the graveside, her face a stone carving of grief. She did not speak to David. She did not look at him. She simply accepted the folded flag. Sarah had been an Air Force brat, and stared at the polished casket, her hatred for the man who had broken her daughter's heart, a palpable physical force. David was alone. And then he wasn't. Chloe Sanders, after her initial shock, had regrouped. She had a new strategy. She showed up at his Terrytown house a week after the funeral, dressed in modest funereal black. She brought a casserole. "David," she said softly, stepping inside before he could stop her. "I know you're in pain, and I know I was shocked at the hospital. I didn't mean to react that way. It was just all so much." David, who was operating on 3 hours of sleep and pure self-loathing, just stared at her. "You laughed, Chloe." "I was hysterical." She lied, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. "It was all so awful. Sarah, and then twins. I broke. But I'm here now. We're in this together, David. You, me, and our baby." She placed a hand on her flat stomach. "We can raise them all, together. A new family." David looked at her, at this woman who had called his dying wife a complication, and felt a revulsion so deep it almost made him gag. "Get out," he whispered. "What, David, don't be like this. I'm pregnant with your child." "Get out of my house. Get out of my life," he roared, the first real emotion other than grief flashing through him. "You laughed when she died. You stood there and you were happy. Get out before I call the police." Chloe's face hardened. The mask was off. "You'll regret this, David. You can't just throw me away. I'm carrying your baby. I'm not going anywhere." "We'll see about that," he said, slamming the door in her face. He was trapped. A single father to two premature babies he barely felt connected to, and a pregnant, monstrous mistress who was threatening to ruin him. His nightmare was only just beginning. 2 weeks later, he was called into a meeting at St. David's. He assumed it was about the twins' discharge plan. But when he walked in, it wasn't just Dr. Miller. A grim-faced hospital administrator, Robert Paulson, and a man in a suit, Dr. Aaron Patel, the head of hospital genetics, were also at the table. "Mr. Harris, please sit down," Paulson said, his tone formal. "Is it the twins? Are they okay?" David asked, his heart seizing. "The twins are stabilizing," Dr. Miller said gently. This is about something else. David, when you and Sarah went through your IVF treatment at Austin IVF, there were multiple cycles, correct? "Yes," David said, confused. 8 over the years. This last one was the one that worked. Dr. Patel cleared his throat and opened a file. "Mr. Harris, as part of the NICU workup for premature twins, we ran a full genetic panel, just to rule out any congenital issues." He paused and looked at the administrator, who nodded. "Mr. Harris, Doctor," Patel continued. "During the course of this routine screening, we found an anomaly, a genetic discrepancy. We cross-referenced the twins' DNA with the sample you provided at admission." He took a deep breath. "David, the genetic markers show you are not the twins' biological father." The silence in the room was absolute. David just stared. "What? That's impossible. That's absurd. We did IVF. It was our embryos." "No," Dr. Miller said, her voice aching with sympathy. "It was Sarah's egg, but the sperm sample, it wasn't yours." Paulson, the administrator, cut in his voice all business. "It appears there was a catastrophic error at the fertility clinic. Austin IVF is a separate entity, but they have privileges at our hospital. We've cross-referenced their records for that day. It appears your sample was misplaced, and another patient's sample was used to fertilize Ms. Jenkins's eggs." David couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. The babies, Oliver and Olivia, the only things left of Sarah. They weren't his. His sacrifice, his betrayal, his lies, the stress that he was convinced had contributed to Sarah's death. It was all for nothing. He had destroyed his life and lost his wife for another man's children. "Who?" David finally choked out. "A couple," Dr. Miller said softly. "Mark and Jessica Bishop. They were also patients. They've been trying for 10 years. They were told their last cycle failed." David Harris began to laugh. It was a broken, horrifying sound, echoing the one he'd heard in the waiting room. He was a man who had everything, and in the span of 3 weeks had been left with absolutely cosmically nothing. The news from Dr. Patel didn't just break David Harris. It unmade him. The grief for Sarah had been a tangible, crushing weight. The guilt had been a fire searing him from the inside out. But this new knowledge, this was something else entirely. It was a vacuum. It sucked the very marrow from his bones, leaving him a hollow, weightless shell. He walked out of the administrator's office, floated down the elevator, and drove his car back to the glass house in Tarrytown. He was in the most profound and terrible way free. He was a man with no wife, no children, and no future. He was a ghost in his own life. He walked into the house. Sarah's peonies, the ones from that last awful day, were long dead, their petals a brown, papery confetti on the marble console. He walked past the living room, through his empty office, and up the stairs. He went to the sage green nursery. 2 empty cribs stood waiting. 2 matching mobiles, little hand-knitted lambs hung in the still air. All the love, all the hope, all the 7-year-long desperation that had been poured into this room, it was for nothing. His betrayal, his lies, the stress he was convinced had triggered Sarah's fatal decline. He had done it all, sacrificed his wife, for children who were not even his. He had burned his world to the ground to protect a family that never existed. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall between the 2 cribs. He did not cry. He was beyond tears. He sat there as the sun set, the room plunging into darkness, and he felt the man he was, David Harris, the brilliant architect, the loving husband, the fraud, finally mercifully die. A new man rose in his place, a man with nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous and most focused man in the world. This new man had only one purpose: to dismantle the past. He was an architect, after all. He had built this life. Now he would design its demolition. At 7 a.m., he called his lawyer. Stephen Carr was David's corporate attorney, a man who navigated the brutal world of Austin real estate development with the cold precision of a shark. He was used to David's frantic calls about zoning laws and permit bureaucracy. He was not prepared for this. He met David in his sterile downtown office. "David," Stephen said, his face a practiced mask of sympathy. I was so sorry to hear about Sarah. It's a tragedy. I've already started the paperwork for her estate probate." "Stop," David said. His voice was flat, dead. "That's not why I'm here." David laid out the entire story. The IVF, the HELP syndrome, the death, the twins, and finally the genetic report. Stephen Carr, a man who had seen billion-dollar deals collapse and partners backstab each other, was speechless. He took off his glasses, polished them, and looked at his client. "My God, David, Austin IVF. They are finished." "That's your first job," David said. "I want you to file a wrongful death suit. I want you to file for catastrophic malpractice. I want you to find every dollar they have and every dollar their insurance has, and I want you to take it. We're going to create a memorial fund, the Sarah Jenkins Harris Memorial Fund. It will fund HELP syndrome research and support families destroyed by fertility clinic negligence. I want you to ruin them, Stephen. Not for me, for her." Carr nodded slowly, the shark in him smelling blood. "It will be a landmark case. It will be done." "Second," David continued, his eyes like chips of ice. "Chloe Sanders." "The Mistress," Carr said, his tone shifting to distaste. "Messy. She'll have to be paid off. She's pregnant. I assume she'll claim." "She is claiming. She's claiming it's mine. I don't think it is." "A paternity test, then. We can—" "No," David interrupted. "Not just a test. I want to know everything. You use my money, you hire the best private investigator in this state. I want her keycard records from the firm for the last 6 months. I want her expense reports. I want her credit card statements, her Uber receipts, her hotel stays. I want to know who she was with every single night she wasn't with me. She was hedging her bets, Stephen. I was just one of her prospects. I want to know who the other one was." Carr looked at the man in front of him. This was not the grieving widower. This was an executioner. This isn't just a legal strategy, David. This is a reckoning. "Call it whatever you want," David said, standing up. "Just get it done. And find the real parents of those children. I want to meet them." The meeting with Chloe was set for 3 days later. The investigator was fast. David had the file. It was worse and better than he could have imagined. He chose a bright, soulless Starbucks on a busy corner, a place with no memories and no shadows. She walked in, and David was struck by the audacity of her performance. She wasn't dressed in black. She was wearing a cream-colored, expensive-looking pantsuit, an outfit for a new beginning. Her hand was resting possessively on her barely there bump. She was not here to grieve with him. She was here to negotiate the terms of her new life. "David," she said, her voice a soft purr of manufactured sympathy. She sat down, her expensive bag clicking on the table. "I'm so glad you're finally ready to see reason. I know you're in pain, I truly do. But this," she caressed her stomach, "is a blessing. A fresh start for us. I've already had my lawyer draft some preliminary paperwork, a very generous consideration for our future." David just stirred his black coffee, the scraping of the wooden stick the only sound. Chloe leaned in her mask of sympathy, tightening. "Look, I know it's hard to see it now, but this is what Sarah would have wanted. For you to be happy. We can sell that. That mausoleum of a house, find a gorgeous penthouse downtown. Just you, me, and our baby, our real family." David looked up. His eyes were so empty, so devoid of light that Chloe's smile faltered for a second. "The twins aren't mine, Chloe." Her face froze. "What, David, don't be cruel. Just because they're complications doesn't mean you can just—" "They're not my children," he repeated, his voice a monotone. "There was a mix-up at the IVF clinic. A genetic test confirmed it. They belong to another man, another couple. I'm not their father." Chloe stared at him. She processed the information. Disbelief. Confusion. And then, the most profound, sickening relief. It started as a snort, a disbelieving puff of air. Then her shoulders started to shake. She covered her mouth, but it was no use. A high, ringing laugh burst out of her. People at other tables turned to look. "Oh my God!" she gasped, tears of actual mirth streaming from her eyes. She put her head down on the table, her body convulsing with laughter. "You're serious? Oh, David, that is priceless." She sat up, wiping her eyes, her face flushed with victory. You went through all that. You lost everything. For nothing. For someone else's brats. Oh my God. You really are the most pathetic fool I have ever met." She collected herself, taking a deep, shuddering breath. Her eyes were shining now, all traces of false sympathy gone, replaced by pure predatory triumph. "Well," she said, straightening her jacket. "Wow. Okay. That just makes things so much cleaner, doesn't it? All that baggage, poof, gone. It's just you, me, and this." She patted her stomach, her smile wide and genuine for the first time. "Our baby, our heir, the real Harris legacy." David just watched her, his expression unchanged. "You're right. It does make things cleaner." He slid a thick manila file across the table. Chloe's smile flickered. "What's that, the paperwork my lawyer sent?" "No," David said. "It's from my lawyer's investigator." She opened it. Her smile vanished. Inside were photographs. Her kissing Alex Vance, a senior partner at the firm, in the parking garage of the W Hotel. Hotel receipts expensed to the firm for nights she had told David she was working late. Credit card statements showing dinners at Uchi with Vance. "I was a fool," David said, his voice quiet, surgical. "I was so wrapped up in my own lies I couldn't see yours. You weren't in love with me, Chloe. You were just auditioning, seeing which partner at the firm would bite first. I was just plan A. How's plan B?" He slid a second document on top of the file. "The court order." I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her face turning a chalky white. That's a court order for a prenatal paternity test, David said. It names both me and Alex Vance as potential fathers. My lawyer, Stephen Carr, is very thorough. He sent a copy to Alex's lawyer and to Alex's wife about an hour ago. Chloe's world imploded. The color drained from her face. Her mouth opened, but only a small choking sound came out. This was a reckoning she had never anticipated. She had overplayed her hand, and now she had lost everything. You laughed when my wife died, David said, standing up from the table. You laughed when you found out my children weren't mine. Laugh now, Chloe. He left her there, a statue of her own ambition, the file open in front of her, as the other patrons of the Starbucks watched her silent, frantic, and complete collapse. The paternity test a few weeks later confirmed it. The baby was Alex Vance's. Vance, in a desperate bid to save his own marriage and career, promptly denied everything, fired Chloe for gross professional misconduct, and had his wife's lawyers serve her with a cease and desist order. Chloe Sanders, who had gambled on landing a rich husband, was left pregnant, unemployed, and utterly alone, a pariah, in the city she had tried to conquer. 2 days later, Dr. Miller facilitated the hardest meeting of David's life. Mark and Jessica Bishop looked like they had been hollowed out by a decade of grief. They were kind, gentle people from a small town outside Austin, and they looked at David with a terrifying, unreadable combination of pity, gratitude, and sorrow. Mr. Harris, Jessica whispered. Her hands knotted together. We don't know what to say. We are so sorry for your loss. For your wife, Sarah. David just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Dr. Miller led them all to the NICU. Nurse Brenda, her eyes soft with sympathy, was waiting. David stood back as Mark and Jessica approached the 2 incubators. Mark pressed his hand to the plastic of Oliver's isolette. He has my father's ears. He choked out, tears instantly flooding his eyes. Jessica just stared at Olivia, her entire body shaking, a sound of pure, unadulterated awe escaping her. She's real. Oh, Mark, after all this time, she's real. David watched them. He watched this pure, untainted love pour out of them. This was the first good, the first right thing that had happened since that last perfect Sunday. This was the family Oliver and Olivia were meant to have. We want to honor Sarah, Mark said, turning to David, his face a mess of tears and joy. We'd like Olivia's middle name to be Sarah, if that's okay with you. The dam broke. The first real tears of a grief so profound he hadn't been able to touch it, stung David's eyes. He nodded. Yes, she would. She would have liked that. He watched Nurse Brenda help Jessica hold her daughter for the first time. He watched Mark put a single finger into Oliver's tiny hand and watched the baby grip it. He was the outsider. He was the ghost. His role in this story was over. He turned unseen and walked out of the NICU, leaving the Bishops to their miracle. The dismantling was swift. The lawsuit against Austin IVF settled for a staggering sum, bankrupting the clinic and making national news. The Sarah Jenkins Harris Memorial Fund was established the next day. David sold the glass house in Tarrytown. He sold his partnership at the firm. He liquidated every stock, every bond, every last trace of his old life. His last stop was Margaret Jenkins's house. She opened the door. She had aged a decade. The Texas granite of her face was cracked, revealing a raw, bottomless grief. Margaret, he said. He was holding a single cashier's check. She just stared at him, her eyes burning with a cold, pure hatred. "It's everything," he whispered, his voice breaking. "The house, the firm, the stocks. It's all I have left. It's for her, for you." He held it out. She looked at the check, then back at him. "Do you think this brings her back?" she hissed, her voice like gravel. "No, nothing does." "She loved you," Margaret said, and the words were a final, damning verdict. "She knew. She told me the week before. She knew you were cheating, and she was going to stay. For the baby. Your lies, the stress. You and that whore. You did this. The doctors can call it HELP syndrome. I call it murder." David stood there and took it. He had no defense. "I know." She snatched the check from his hand. "Good. I hope you live 1,000 years, David, and I hope you remember her face and what you did to her every single second of it." She slammed the door in his face. He was done. David Harris walked away. He got into an old used pickup truck he'd bought with the last of his cash. He had one bag in the passenger seat. He drove out of Austin past the skyline he had helped to build. He didn't look back. He drove west into the vast, empty heart of Texas until the city was just a smear of light in his rearview mirror. He stopped at a gas station in the middle of nowhere, the wind whipping dust across the road. He looked at his reflection in the dirty bathroom mirror. The man looking back was a stranger, gaunt, haunted, empty. The architect was gone. The husband was gone. The father was gone. All that was left was the ghost. He got back in the truck, pointed it toward the setting sun, and drove into the darkness, a man with no name, no past, and no future. Just the long, empty road. In the end, there were no winners. There was only the devastating wreckage of choices made in secret. David lost his wife, his children, and his entire identity. Chloe, who laughed at another's tragedy, found herself the star of her own abandoned and ruined by the very ambition that drove her. But two lives, Oliver and Olivia, were saved from the rubble. They are to this day being raised by a loving, grateful family who never gave up hope. This story is a brutal reminder that a lie can't just build a new future. It can only annihilate the present. The truth, no matter how delayed, always finds its way to the surface. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a story of twists and consequences, and subscribe to the channel for more true-life drama every week. Let me know in the comments what you think. Was David's final act a form of redemption, or was it simply the last act of a coward? We'll see you in the next one. What if the woman who destroyed your past was suddenly forced to face you for her future? In the glittering skyscrapers of New York, a brutal betrayal shatters a perfect marriage. A powerful CEO, Richard Sterling, coldly divorces his pregnant wife Eleanor for his ambitious mistress Isabella. He leaves his wife with nothing but a broken heart and the child he'll never know. But fate has a long memory. 25 years later, a federal courthouse becomes a stage for the ultimate reckoning. A new judge, known for his unbending integrity, is assigned a landmark fraud case. The defendant, the ruthless Isabella Sterling. The judge, James Vance. The son, Richard Abandoned. Stay with us as we unravel a story where the gavel of justice is held by the hand of the victim. The penthouse on Park Avenue wasn't just a home, it was a statement. It was 30,000 square feet of Italian marble, floor-to-ceiling glass, and curated art that screamed new money, trying desperately to look old. This was the domain of Richard Sterling, the CEO and founder of Sterling Global Enterprises, a man who had devoured the worlds of logistics and private equity with the same predatory grace he used to navigate a gala. And beside him, the perfect accessory to his empire, was Eleanor Vance Sterling. She was not a product of his world. She was, he often thought, the last genuine thing he owned. Eleanor was Vassar-educated, with a quiet intelligence and a warmth that smoothed Richard's abrasive edges. She ran 3 of the city's largest charities, not for the photo ops, but because she genuinely believed in the work. Tonight they were hosting their annual Sterling Foundation benefit. Men in bespoke Tom Ford suits, and women in cascading diamonds filled the space, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low murmur of strategic alliances. "Richard, darling," a voice purred, cutting through the din. It was Isabella Rossi, a junior analyst from Richard's M&A Mergers and Acquisitions department. She was everything Eleanor was not: sharp raven-haired, with eyes that didn't just look at you, but appraised you. She wore a crimson dress that seemed painted on a stark, deliberate slash of color in a room of elegant neutrals. "Isabella, you've been doing incredible work on the new Singapore fund," Richard said, his voice a professional baritone, but his eyes lingered a fraction of a second too long. Eleanor, standing nearby, felt a familiar cold prickle of unease. It had been happening for 6 months. The late nights Richard blamed on closing the Tokyo market. The sudden whispered phone calls he took on the terrace. The detached, almost clinical way he'd begun to look at her. She placed a hand on her stomach, a small, barely there curve. It was her secret, her anchor. She was 3 months pregnant. She was waiting for the perfect moment to tell him, a moment to shatter this strange new tension and bring him back to her. Later that night, after the last guest had departed, Eleanor found Richard in his study, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. The city lights reflected in his eyes, but he seemed to be seeing nothing. "Richard," she said softly, "can we talk?" "I'm busy, Eleanor. This Singapore deal is—" "It can wait," she said, her voice firmer now. She walked over and stood in front of him, blocking his view. "I have something to tell you. Something wonderful." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "What is it, Richard?" She took a breath, her hands shaking slightly as she took his and placed them on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby." She watched his face, expecting, what, shock, joy, elation. She got none of it. Richard Sterling's face went blank. It was the same look he gave a hostile board member right before a corporate execution. He didn't pull his hands away. He simply let them fall lifeless. "A baby," he said. The words were flat, dead. "Yes," she whispered, the joy in her chest turning to ice. Isn't it wonderful, Eleanor?" he said, turning from her and walking to his desk. He picked up a thick, cream-colored envelope. "We need to discuss the restructuring." "Restructuring? What are you talking about? Richard, did you hear me?" "I heard you," he said, not looking at her. He slid the envelope across the polished mahogany desk. "This is from Arthur Kensington, at Cravath, Swain and Moore. My attorney." Eleanor stared at the envelope. Her blood ran cold. "Your attorney?" "I'm filing for divorce," he said as calmly as if ordering lunch. "And I'm moving Isabella into the guest suite tomorrow while this is settled. It's time to consolidate my assets." Eleanor's world tilted. The room, the marble, the glass, the skyline, all of it blurred into a vortex of pain. "Isabella," she choked out. That child in the red dress, Richard, no, I'm pregnant. With your child." He finally looked at her. His eyes were not angry or sad. They were bored. They were calculating. "That," Richard Sterling said, straightening his tie, is an unfortunate complication for you. Not for me. You see Eleanor in business, you cut your losses. You don't double down on a failing investment. He turned back to the window, the glittering city reflecting his ambition. You'll be hearing from Arthur in the morning. He'll be generous, I'm sure. Within reason. Eleanor stood frozen, her hand on her stomach, a silent scream trapped in her throat. She had just announced the creation of a new life. And in response, he had just announced the execution of hers. The days that followed were not a divorce. They were a corporate dismantling. Eleanor learned quickly that the man she had loved for 7 years did not exist. In his place was Richard Sterling, CEO, and she was no longer a wife, but a hostile entity to be managed and neutralized. Arthur Kensington Richards' lawyer was a shark in a $5,000 suit. He was the kind of man who enjoyed breaking things just to see how they splintered. They met in a sterile conference room on the 50th floor of the Sterling Global building, a place Eleanor herself had helped design. Mrs. Sterling, Kensington began, smiling a smile that never reached his eyes. Richard is prepared to be very equitable. He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a settlement offer. Eleanor, despite her shock, was no fool. She'd read her own prenup years ago. She was entitled to 20% of his assets acquired during the marriage. With Sterling Global's explosive growth, that meant she was entitled to a fortune. The number on the paper was not a fortune. It was an insult. It was enough to buy a nice apartment in Brooklyn, perhaps. Not enough to live. It was go-away money. "This is a mistake," Eleanor said, her voice shaking but cold. "The prenup states." "Ah, the prenup," Kensington interrupted, steepling his fingers. "Yes, a document. But documents, Mrs. Sterling, are subject to interpretation. And of course, assets are a very fluid concept." "What does that mean?" "It means," Kensington said, leaning in, "that Sterling Global has been undergoing significant, and I must say brilliant, restructuring for the last 8 months. Offshore holdings, new shell corporations. The on-paper value of Mr. Sterling's domestic assets to which the prenup applies is, well, it's what you see on that paper." Eleanor stared at him. He hid the money. He's been planning this for 8 months. "Mr. Sterling is a brilliant strategist," Kensington said, "in business and in life." "And Isabella," Eleanor whispered. "Miss Rosie," Kensington corrected, "has been invaluable in this transition. Her insights into international finance law are truly singular." The betrayal was deeper than she could have ever imagined. It wasn't a sudden, passionate affair. It was a cold, calculated coup. Isabella hadn't just seduced her husband. She had actively helped him liquidate Eleanor's entire future. "And the baby," Eleanor's voice was barely audible. Kensington's smile vanished. "Mr. Sterling is skeptical of the timing. He will, of course, contest paternity, a lengthy and no doubt public court battle, unless, of course, you accept the current offer and agree to a non-disclosure agreement that covers everything, for all time." It was a checkmate. He was threatening to drag her pregnant and humiliated through the New York tabloids, painting her as a liar and a gold digger, all while the real gold digger was redecorating her penthouse. That night, Eleanor didn't just pack her bags. She erased herself. She took her maiden name back, Eleanor Vance. She took the small inheritance her grandmother had left her, sold the jewelry Richard had given her. It felt like poison on her skin anyway, and bought a one-way train ticket to Boston. As the train slid out of Penn Station, she watched the Sterling Global Tower, her tower recede into the skyline. Isabella Rossi was already there. Paparazzi photos had captured her moving in not through the service entrance, but through the front lobby, bold and triumphant. 2 days after Eleanor arrived in Boston, the divorce was finalized. She signed the papers in a cramped notary's office that smelled of stale coffee. 7 months later, in a small hospital in Back Bay, Eleanor Vance gave birth to a son. He had her eyes, but he had Richard's determined chin. She held him to her chest, the pain and humiliation of the past year receding into a fierce, protective love. "Hello, James," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "James Vance. It's just you and me, and I promise you I will never let anyone hurt you. I will teach you everything about integrity and justice and honor, all the things he never knew." While Eleanor was learning to be a mother, Richard Sterling was on the cover of Forbes. He and Isabella Rossi were married in a lavish $10 million ceremony in Lake Como. The headline read, "The Ultimate Merger, Sterling and Rossi Combine Forces." Eleanor saw the magazine in a CVS checkout line. She looked at the photo of Richard and his new radiant bride. Then she looked down at the tiny sleeping face of her son. "He chose that," she whispered to James. "And I got you." It was not a fair trade, but in that moment, Eleanor Vance decided it would be a winning one. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. The next 25 years were a study in contrasts. In New York, the empire of Richard and Isabella Sterling grew into a colossus. Sterling Global Enterprises, now with Isabella as COO, became infamous for its ruthless take-no-prisoners expansion. They bought out competitors, stripped them for parts, and laid off thousands, all while their personal wealth ballooned into the tens of billions. They had a daughter, Chloe Sterling, who was raised by a team of nannies and became a notorious tabloid fixture, famous for her disastrous reality TV appearances and designer drug habits. Richard's life was a fortress of glass and steel, opulent, impressive, and utterly cold. He rarely, if ever, thought of the son he'd dismissed as a failing investment. In Boston, life was built on a different foundation. Eleanor Vance raised James in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Brookline. She worked as a paralegal during the day and put herself through law school at night at Suffolk University. She didn't just become a lawyer, she became a warrior. Eleanor joined the Legal Aid Society, fighting for tenants, against slumlords, for spouses in domestic abuse cases, for all the people. The Richard Sterlings of the world, crushed without a second thought. She never poisoned James against his father. She didn't have to. She simply told him the truth once, when he was old enough to ask. "Your father," she told him over dinner when he was 12, "is a very successful man. But he made a choice. He chose his business over his family. He chose money over honor. That is his life. It is not ours." That conversation lit a fire in James. He saw his mother's exhaustion, her quiet dignity, her relentless fight for people who had no one. He didn't want his father's money or his name. He wanted to undo what his father represented. He inherited Richard's sharp intellect and ambition, but he filtered it through Eleanor's profound empathy and ironclad sense of justice. James was brilliant. He devoured books on history, philosophy, and law. He graduated top of his class, got a full scholarship to Harvard Law, and became the editor of the Law Review. While Chloe Sterling was being arrested for a DUI in a Lamborghini, James Vance was clerking for a federal judge. He didn't go into corporate law, where he could have named his price. He joined the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. He wanted to be in the arena. James Vance became a prosecutor known for his surgical precision and his utter lack of fear. He didn't just prosecute, he dismantled. His specialty was complex financial crime. He loved nothing more than taking down arrogant, untouchable white-collar criminals who believed the law was for other people. His closing arguments were legendary, not fiery, but cold, logical, and devastating. His most famous case was United States versus Peterson, where he successfully convicted a hedge fund billionaire, Mark Peterson, for a massive insider trading scheme. Peterson, much like Richard Sterling, had tried to hide his assets in a web of offshore accounts. James, with a near-obsessive zeal, had unraveled every single one. His success was meteoric. After 8 years as a prosecutor, his reputation for integrity and intellect was so profound that when a spot opened on the federal bench for the Southern District, his name was at the top of the list. At 34, James Vance became one of the youngest federal judges ever appointed in New York history. The Honorable James Vance. He bought his mother a beautiful brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, overlooking the very skyline that had once been her prison. On the day of his investiture, Eleanor stood in the packed courtroom, her eyes blurred with tears as her son put on the black robe. He was the living, breathing embodiment of her victory. James never used his father's name. He never contacted him. To him, Richard Sterling was just another headline, a symbol of the very corruption he had sworn a sacred oath to fight. He was a ghost, a cautionary tale. He had no idea that the ghost was about to walk into his courtroom. The downfall of Isabella Sterling didn't happen all at once. It was a masterpiece of hubris, a death by 1,000 cuts, all self-inflicted, as COO of Sterling Global. Isabella was the true engine of the company. Richard had become the figurehead, the aging lion who enjoyed the reputation, while Isabella did the actual killing. She was bolder than Richard, more reckless. She didn't just bend the rules. She rewrote them. Her great project was the Helios Initiative, a multi-billion-dollar acquisition of sustainable energy companies across South America. It was meant to greenwash Sterling Global's reputation and be her crowning achievement. But the Helios Initiative was a lie. The companies Isabella was acquiring were mostly worthless. They were shell corporations, many of which she secretly controlled through a labyrinth of offshore accounts registered in Panama and the Cayman Islands. She wasn't buying assets. She was siphoning Sterling Global's capital directly into her own pockets. It was a staggering, complex fraud. She was using company money to buy her own fake companies at massively inflated prices. She was cooking the books, filing false reports with the SEC, and lying to shareholders, all while pocketing billions. The first thread was pulled by a young, hungry analyst at the SEC. An algorithm flagged an irregular wire transfer, $50 million, to a Panamanian holding company called Apex Solutions, an entity that seemed to have no employees and no office. The SEC started digging. They dug for 2 years. What they found was a criminal enterprise so vast it shocked even them. They referred the case to the U.S. Attorney's Office, James Vance's old stomping grounds. The feds built their case with the same meticulous care James himself would have used. They flipped a terrified junior accountant. They got wiretaps. They traced the money from Panama to a private vault in Switzerland, all under an alias I. Rossi. The indictment was explosive. Isabella Sterling was arrested by FBI agents at her favorite table at Le Bernardin in the middle of lunch. She was charged with 28 counts of wire fraud, securities, fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The media went insane. It was the biggest white-collar crime case of the decade. And then came the judicial assignment. The case, United States of America v. Isabella Sterling, was assigned by random lottery. It landed on the desk of the Honorable James Vance. James saw the name on the case file. Sterling. His heart didn't stop. It didn't pound. It simply went cold. This was her. The woman in the red dress. The woman who had helped destroy his mother and cast him and Eleanor out into the dark. His clerk, a young woman named Sarah, looked at him. "Judge, you know who that is, right? That's Richard Sterling's wife. This is going to be a circus." James stared at the file. Ethics. The law was clear. Any appearance of bias was grounds for recusal. And this was the mother of all biases. He should recuse himself. He should hand it off to Judge Miller or Judge Chen. It was the safe, simple, ethical thing to do. He thought of his mother working 3 jobs while he was a baby. He thought of her crying at night when she thought he was asleep. He thought of the smug, triumphant face of Isabella Sterling on the cover of Forbes. And then he thought of his oath. To administer justice without respect to persons and do equal right to the poor and to the rich. He could be impartial. He knew he could. He would be harder on himself, more rigorous, more exacting than any other judge. He would not give her an inch of bias either for or against. He would be the pure, uncorrupted instrument of the law. He would show her and the world what real justice looked like. "Sarah," James said, his voice quiet and firm, "clear my calendar for the pretrial conference, and get me every filing from the prosecution and the defense. I'm not recusing." Sarah's eyes widened. "Judge, are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life," James said, opening the file. "Mrs. Sterling has been assigned her judge. Let's get to work." The U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York was a fortress of justice. Courtroom 26B. James's courtroom was a grand oak-paneled room, and it was packed. The trial of Isabella Sterling was the hottest ticket in town. Journalists, legal analysts, and the simply curious filled every seat in the gallery. Isabella Sterling entered flanked by a high-priced legal team from Paul Weiss. She looked diminished. Gone was the triumphant COO. In her place was a woman in a severe beige suit, her black hair pulled back tightly. She looked pale, but her eyes were still defiant. She scanned the courtroom, her gaze sliding over James without a hint of recognition. To her, he was just a judge, a functionary in her way. "All rise," the bailiff called out. James entered from his chambers, his black robe settling around him. The room went silent. He sat the weight of the moment settling on him. He looked down at the defendant. "This court is now in session," James said, his voice echoing in the chamber. "The case of the United States v. Isabella Sterling. Are both sides ready to present their opening statements?" The trial began. For 2 weeks, the prosecution methodically laid out its case. They presented wire transfers, bank records, and the damning testimony of the accountant they had flipped. It was a clinical, devastating picture of greed. James presided with an icy calm, overruling and sustaining objections with textbook precision. He gave Isabella's defense team no room to complain of bias. Isabella's defense was simple. She was a woman in a man's world. She was the victim. She had been manipulated, set up, and framed by her own husband, Richard Sterling. On the 15th day of the trial, Isabella's lead attorney, Sharon Mills, stood. "The defense calls Richard Sterling to the stand." A murmur went through the gallery. The grand doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and he walked in. James's breath hitched. He had not seen this man in person in his entire life. He had only seen the photos. The man who entered was older, grayer, and thinner than the Forbes cover. He looked broken. The predatory arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, weary fear. Richard Sterling walked to the witness box. He was sworn in. He sat his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Sterling," the defense attorney began. "You were the CEO of Sterling Global, correct?" "Yes," Richard said, his voice reedy. "And Isabella, your wife, was your COO?" "Yes." Who Mr. Sterling was really in charge. For the next 4 hours, the defense painted Richard as a weak, detached figurehead, a man who had long since lost control of his own company. And then they painted him as a conspirator who, upon finding out about the SEC investigation, had planted evidence to make Isabella the sole scapegoat. James watched his face an unreadable mask. He was judging a trial between the woman who destroyed his family and the man who abandoned him. The air in his lungs felt like static. Then it was the prosecution's turn for cross-examination. The AUSA Assistant U.S. Attorney, a sharp woman named Anya Sharma, approached the witness. "Mr. Sterling, your wife claims you framed her. Is that true?" "No, of course not," Richard said, his voice rising. I had no idea what she was doing. The shell company's the fraud. It was all her. She controlled the finances. I trusted her." "You trusted her," Sharma repeated. "Just as your first wife, Eleanor Vance, trusted you. Is that correct?" "Objection!" the defense screamed. "Relevance. This is character assassination. Sustained." James said, his voice level, though his knuckles were white on his gavel. "The jury will disregard the last statement. Ms. Sharma, move on." Sharma nodded, the point already made. She projected a new document on the screen. "Mr. Sterling, can you identify this document?" It was a bank transfer from Sterling Global to the Panamanian shell, Apex Solutions. But this one was different. It wasn't authorized by Isabella. It was authorized by R. Sterling. Richard stared at it. I don't remember this." "That's your signature, is it not?" Sharma pressed. "It looks like it, but Isabella, she handled all of that. She must have forged it." "So your testimony," Sharma said, "is that you are either a co-conspirator or a complete idiot. Which one is it, Mr. Sterling?" "Objection. Sustained," James said. He looked at his father. The man on the stand was a liar, a coward, and a fool. He was pathetic. All the anger James had held for 25 years, it just evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, empty pity. This was the man his mother had loved. This was the man who had thrown him away. He was nothing. The trial continued. But as James watched the dynamic between Richard and Isabella, two serpents devouring each other on the stand, he had no idea the real twist, the one that would break the case, and his own composure was yet to come. The trial was in its 3rd week. Richard Sterling's testimony had damaged the defense, but it had also implicated him creating a he said, she said scenario of 2 corrupt executives. Isabella's defense was leaning hard on the idea that she was the scapegoat. The jury looked confused. It was then that the prosecution announced a surprise rebuttal witness. "The people call Maria Sanchez to the stand." A small, nervous-looking woman in her late 60s walked into the courtroom. She looked terrified, clutching a worn leather handbag. "Who is this?" Isabella whispered, panicked, to her lawyer. Her lawyer just shook his head, looking blindsided. The prosecutor, Anya Sharma, began. Ms. Sanchez, where were you employed for the last 30 years? I was an executive assistant, Maria said, her voice soft. At Sterling Global Enterprises. And who specifically did you work for? At first I worked for Mr. Sterling, back in the old building. Then I was assigned to Ms. Rossi when she was promoted. Isabella Sterling went white. You were Isabella Rossi's personal assistant. Yes, for 28 years. I retired 2 years ago, right before all this, Miss Sanchez, Sharma said, walking slowly toward the witness box. During your time as Ms. Sterling's assistant, were you aware of her financial dealings? Objection, the defense yelled. Privilege hearsay. The witness can testify as to her own observations, counselor, James said, his eyes fixed on Maria. Overruled. Proceed, Ms. Sharma. I saw things, Maria said, her hands shaking. I managed her private calendars, her private travel, and I managed her private files, things that weren't on the company server. And what was in those files? She was very particular. She kept ledgers, real ones, not the ones she gave to the accountants. She had a private safe behind a painting in her office. She made me clear it out when she heard the SEC was investigating. She told me to shred everything. And did you? Sharma asked. Maria took a deep, trembling breath. No, I couldn't. What she was doing, it was wrong. She wasn't a good person. She fired my son from the mailroom because he was sick for a week. Just threw him out. After I had given her 25 years. I kept a copy. Of everything. On a hard drive. I gave it to the FBI last week. The courtroom erupted. Isabella lunged forward, screaming, You lying bitch! You were a secretary! Order! James slammed his gavel. Order in this court. Mrs. Sterling, one more outburst like that, and you will be held in contempt. Control your client, counselor. Isabella was forced back into her seat by her lawyers, her face a mask of pure hatred. Sharma smiled a cold, thin smile. The prosecution would like to enter into evidence People's Exhibit 44B, the Rossi Ledger. It was a digital file projected onto the large screens. It was a forensic accountant's dream. It detailed every single fraudulent wire transfer, every shell company, every bribe. It was an undeniable, irrefutable confession of her guilt in the Helios fraud. Isabella's case was over. James watched his face impassive. Justice was being done. But wait, Sharma said. There's more. Ms. Sanchez, can you direct us to the folder labeled Archive? Maria nodded. Yes. Folder Vintage. Sharma clicked it. The folder opened. It contained only one subfolder. It was labeled EV Settlement, 1999. Richard Sterling, who was sitting in the front row as a material witness, shot to his feet. What is that? Sit down, Mr. Sterling, James commanded, his voice cracking for the first time. The courtroom was dead silent. James stared at the folder, his heart pounding against his ribs so hard he thought it might break them. EV, 1999. Eleanor Vance. Ms. Sharma, James said, his voice a strained whisper. What is the relevance of this file? Your Honor, Sharma, said her voice full of ice. This file created 25 years ago details the first major fraud committed by the defendant. It would seem Ms. Rossi, then a junior analyst, made her bones by proving her loyalty to Mr. Sterling. This file contains a detailed list of shadow accounts, offshore holdings, and hidden assets created with the specific purpose of concealing Mr. Sterling's true net worth from his wife during their divorce proceedings. She projected a memo. It was from Isabella to Richard. Subject EV Asset Management. Rick, I've moved the $400M from the Lehman Fund into the 3 new Cayman entities. Her lawyer will never find it. The prenup will only apply to the domestic accounts we've declared. Your unfortunate complication will be handled. The unfortunate complication. James stopped breathing. This wasn't just a corporate coup. This wasn't just an affair. This was a targeted, malicious, and criminal act designed to render a pregnant woman and her unborn child destitute. This woman, Isabella, hadn't just stolen a husband. She had stolen his mother's future. She had stolen his future. He looked at Richard Sterling. His father was staring at the screen, his face ashen. He looked genuinely shocked. He looked like he'd been betrayed too. He'd known they were hiding money, but he'd clearly never known how Isabella had done it, or how complete the deception was. He'd let her handle it, and she had, with a brutal sociopathic efficiency. James looked at the jury. They were staring, horrified. He looked at the defendant. Isabella Sterling was no longer defiant. She was staring at the screen not in anger, but with a strange, cold pride, as if admiring her own handiwork. And then James made the mistake of looking into the gallery. In the back row, a woman stood up. She was elegant, her hair a tasteful silver, her face etched with a life of struggle and dignity. It was his mother, Eleanor Vance. She had been attending the trial every day, sitting in the back, a silent, anonymous observer. James had known she was there. They hadn't spoken about it. They didn't need to. Their eyes met across the crowded, silent courtroom. He saw the tears streaming down her face. He saw 25 years of pain, of sacrifice, of lonely nights and quiet strength, all encapsulated in one single devastating look. The courtroom, the lawyers, the jury, they all faded away. There was only his mother and the woman who had tried to destroy them. James Vance picked up his gavel. His hand was not shaking. It was rock solid. "This court," he said, his voice thick with a controlled, righteous fury, "will be in recess for 10 minutes." He stood turned and walked into his chambers, the echo of his mother's silent sob following him. When Judge James Vance re-entered courtroom 26B, the atmosphere had changed. The air once filled with the eager murmurs of the press and the anxious posturing of lawyers was now dead still, suffocating. It was the silence of an execution chamber. James walked to the bench, his black robe feeling less like a garment and more like armor. He sat, and the weight of his office settled onto him, a familiar, comforting pressure. He was no longer the son. He was the court. He looked at the defense table. Isabella's lead attorney, Sharon Mills, looked ashen. The Rossi ledger and the EV settlement file had not just destroyed her case. They had vaporized it. "Does the defense have a closing argument?" James asked, his voice a flat, neutral tone that echoed in the tomb-like room. Mills stood, her movements stiff. She could not refute the evidence. She could not claim innocence. All she had left was a desperate plea for jury nullification. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice strained. "What you have seen, what you have heard, is a story of a complex, difficult world. A world of high-stakes finance where the lines are blurred. Miss Sterling was a participant. Yes, but was she the architect? Or was she a product of an environment created by the man sitting in that front row, Richard Sterling? Was she ambitious? Yes. Was she ruthless? Yes. But was it all her? Or was she, in the end, the one left holding the bag for a generation of corporate malfeasance? Find the reasonable doubt in that. She sat down. It was weak, pathetic, and everyone knew it. Then the prosecutor, Anya Sharma, stood. She walked not to the jury but to the center of the courtroom, standing directly between Isabella and Richard. "Reasonable doubt," she began, her voice a whip crack. "Let us talk about what is reasonable. Is it reasonable to believe that the defendant accidentally created 24 shell companies? Is it reasonable to believe she accidentally siphoned $4 billion from her own company? Is it reasonable to believe that the Rossi ledger, a meticulous, detailed confession of her every crime, is a work of fiction?" She walked to the jury box. "The defense wants you to see blurred lines. Let me make them clear. The defendant, Isabella Sterling, is a predator. She has been a predator for her entire career. We saw the proof. We saw the file labeled EV settlement. We saw how her career began by conspiring to criminally defraud a pregnant woman to render her and her unborn child destitute for her own personal gain. This is not a blurred line. This is a pattern. This is who she is. What she did to Eleanor Vance 25 years ago was the blueprint for what she did to Sterling Global. The only difference was the scale. She pointed at Isabella. She is not a product of her environment. She is the environment. She is the rot. Her entire life, her entire empire is a fraud. And today, that fraud ends. Find her guilty. Find her guilty on all 28 counts. Send a message that the law is not just for the poor or the weak. Send a message that titans can fall. And they must. James delivered his instructions to the jury. It was 11 Sazro a.m. The wait was agonizing. James sat in his chambers, not reading, not working, just staring at the Great Seal of the United States on his wall. He thought of his mother sitting in that back row, her posture a steel rod. He thought of the man in the front row, a stranger made of lies and regret. At 12:04 p.m., the buzzer rang. The jury had a verdict. It had taken them 58 minutes. All rise. The courtroom was electric, every molecule of air vibrating with tension. The jury filed in their faces, grim, unreadable. They did not look at the defendant. It was a terrible sign. Isabella was trembling, a vibration so violent her lawyer had to put a hand on her arm. Richard Sterling looked ill, his face a mottled gray. In the back, Eleanor Vance held her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "Mr. Foreman James," said his voice steady. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor, on the charge of conspiracy to commit wire fraud in violation of 18 U.S. Code Section 1349. How do you find?" The foreman took a breath. "Guilty." A sound, half gasp, half sob, tore from Isabella's throat. "On the charge of wire fraud count 1 in violation of 18 U.S. Code Section 1343, how do you find guilty? On the charge of wire fraud count 2, how do you find guilty? On the charge of wire fraud count 3, guilty." One by one, the foreman read the verdict for all 28 counts. Each guilty was a hammer blow, a nail in the coffin of Isabella's life. With each one, she seemed to shrink, to collapse in on herself. Richard Sterling sank lower in his seat. His head in his hands, a man watching his own name being chiseled onto a tombstone. When the last guilty was read, the room was silent. Isabella was no longer crying. She was just gone. A hollow shell. James looked at his mother. Eleanor Vance had her eyes closed. A single tear, a tear of 25 years, was slowly tracing a path of vindication down her cheek. James's face was stone. He polled the jury, his voice clinical. He thanked them for their service. Sentencing, he said, "Looking at the defense table will be tomorrow morning at 10:00 a.m. He banged the gavel. "This court is adjourned." The next morning, the mood was different. It was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was about the price. Isabella Sterling was led in not in a tailored beige suit, but in a standard-issue, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. Her wrists were cuffed and attached to a chain around her waist. The woman who had graced the cover of Forbes, who had commanded boardrooms and terrified rivals, was now a federal prisoner. The power inversion was absolute. "This court is now in session for the sentencing of the defendant, Isabella Sterling," James announced. "Counselor, does your client wish to make a statement?" Isabella's lawyer nodded, nudging her. Isabella stood, her chains rattling. She looked up at the bench, her eyes wild, searching, and for the first time landing on James, really seeing him. Not as a judge, but as a man. "Your Honor." She began, her voice a desperate, cracking whisper. "Please, please, I know what this looks like. I know what you heard, but that wasn't all me. I was ambitious, yes. I made mistakes. I made terrible mistakes, but it was the world I was in. It was a man's world. I did what I had to do to survive. Richard, he demanded it. He demanded success. He pushed me." She was crying now, fat, ugly tears. "I am not this monster. I'm not. I have a daughter, Chloe. She needs me. She's troubled. Please, Your Honor. I beg you for mercy. Don't take me away from my daughter. Please, I'll do anything. I'll pay it all back. Please, show mercy." She collapsed back into her chair, sobbing. James stared at her, his face a mask. He let the sound of her sobs fill the room for a long, cold moment. "Mercy." James said, his voice quiet, yet it sliced through the room. "You ask for mercy for your daughter." A powerful plea. He paused, his eyes locking on hers. The concept of mercy, Mrs. Sterling, implies a shared understanding of justice, and justice is a debt that must be paid. For 25 years, you have lived a life built on a foundation of malice. The jury has convicted you for the $2.4 billion fraud you perpetrated against Sterling Global. But the evidence presented to this court revealed a pattern of behavior that is singular in its cruelty. He picked up a document. The EV settlement file. You were a junior analyst. You were not surviving in a man's world. You were an architect. You saw a target, a pregnant woman, and you saw an opportunity. You saw a way to prove your value by destroying a life before it could even begin. You did not just defraud a company, Mrs. Sterling. You built your entire career on the scorched earth of other people's lives. Isabella looked up, confused. "Evie, what does that have to do with—" "It has everything to do with it." James's voice suddenly boomed, the judicial calm cracking, revealing the righteous fury beneath. He caught himself taking a deep breath. "It has everything to do with your character, with your motive, with your complete and total lack of remorse. You didn't just make mistakes. You made choices. You chose to steal. You chose to lie. You chose to destroy." He leaned forward. "In your world, people were either assets to be used or liabilities to be cut. You cut Eleanor Vance. You cut your shareholders. You even in the end tried to cut Richard Sterling. In this world, in this courtroom, we do not deal in assets and liabilities. We deal in the law. And the law is not blind to a quarter-century of calculated predatory conduct. You are a serial predator, Mrs. Sterling, and the law has finally caught you. He looked at the sentencing guidelines. With the staggering dollar amount, the abuse of trust, and the sophisticated nature of the crime, the recommendation was 25 to 30 years. You ask this court for mercy, but you have never shown any. You ask me not to take you from your daughter, but you were the instrument that took a father from his son and a future from a mother. The courtroom went dead. Richard Sterling's head shot up. He stared at James, a horrifying, dawning comprehension spreading across his face. He knew. "It is the sentence of this court," James said, his voice dropping to a cold, final baritone, "that you, Isabella Sterling, be committed to the custody of the United States Bureau of Prisons for a term of 30 years. A sound unlike anything human came from Isabella. A high-pitched shriek of pure, agonizing disbelief. "No, no, no! You can't! You can't!" She lunged, trying to get over the table. "Richard, Richard! Do something! You weak, pathetic fool! You let this happen! You let him do this to me! You bastard!" The U.S. Marshals were on her in an instant. They hauled her to her feet, her screams echoing off the marble walls as they dragged her fighting from the courtroom. "This court is adjourned," James said, his voice shaking slightly. He slammed the gavel, the sound like a gunshot. He stood turned and walked into his chambers, the echo of her screams ringing in his ears. He leaned against the door, his hands trembling, his robe feeling impossibly heavy. It was done. He took off the robe, hanging it carefully. He was just James Vance again. He opened the private side door and walked into the long, empty marble hallway. He needed air. He needed his mother. "James?" He stopped, his blood turning to ice. Richard Sterling was standing 20 feet away, his face a wreck of tears and confusion. "James, my God, are you?" James just stared at him. Richard stumbled forward, his hands out. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. About the settlement. I swear to God I didn't know she did that. I let her handle it. I never knew." "You knew she was pregnant," James said, his voice flat, dead. Yes, but you knew you were abandoning your son. You knew you were leaving her with nothing. You knew," James said, taking a step toward him. "The rest, the shell company's the fraud. That's just paperwork. You signed off on the execution. She just held the axe." "Please," Richard whispered, tears streaming down his face. He looked pathetic, a shell of the Titan on the Forbes cover. "Please, son. Can we talk? Can I just know you? I can fix this. The money, what's left, it's yours, it's hers. I can give it all to you." He was trying to buy him. After everything, he was still trying to cut a deal to write a check. James felt a cold, final emptiness. The anger was gone. The hatred was gone. There was just nothing. "You have nothing I want," James said. "You aren't sorry, Mr. Sterling. You're just caught. You're alone. And you've lost." James turned his back on him. At the far end of the long hall, standing in a bright shaft of sunlight from the great arched windows, was Eleanor Vance. She wasn't crying. She wasn't smiling. She was just waiting. Her as she had always been. He walked the length of the hall, his footsteps echoing each one, leaving his past further behind. He walked past the ghost of Richard Sterling, who had shrunk against a pillar, a man erased by his own choices. James walked right up to his mother. He looked at her at the lines of strength and sacrifice etched around her eyes, and the 25 years of judicial calm of prosecutorial steel of a son's guarded heart finally broke. His face crumpled. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick. She didn't hug him, not at first. She just raised her hands and cupped his face, her palms warm and familiar. She looked into his eyes not as a judge, but as her boy. "My son," she said, her voice soft but unbreakable. "My James, you brought the justice." She finally pulled him into an embrace, and he held on to her, the federal judge leaning on his mother. "It's over, baby," she whispered, stroking his hair. "It's all over. Let's go home." Together, mother and son walked out of the courthouse, their shadows long in the afternoon light. They didn't look back. And so the sins of the father were not visited upon the son, they were judged by him. Richard Sterling lost his company, his wife, and the son he never knew, all in one devastating blow. Isabella learned that a life built on deceit will always eventually crumble. And Judge James Vance and his mother Eleanor finally closed a 25-year-old wound, proving that the strongest empires aren't built on money or power, but on integrity and truth. What do you think? Did Judge James make the right call? Should he have recused himself? Or was this the only way to deliver true justice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. This story is a powerful reminder that our actions always have consequences, even if they take decades to arrive. If you were moved by this story of justice and redemption, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a powerful drama, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that will leave you breathless. Thank you for watching.